This new neighbor moved in right across the street from us, and he was all dressed in black, from head to toe dressed in black, and he had long black hair. And I said to my kids, stay away from that guy. He's a drug dealer. And my kids said to me, how do you know? I said, I just know I can tell these things. Anyway, a week later, this guy comes across the street to introduce himself to me. He says, hi, I'm Brian, and I just wanted to say hi. I'm trying to get to know some of the neighbors, but for some reason, they all think I'm a drug dealer. To which I said, you know, some people, they're so narrow-minded.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
My message this morning is entitled, For the Love of Pete. How many of you remember that expression? That's not an expression of our generation. My parents used that expression. How many's parents use that expression? For the love of Pete, clean up your room. What we're going to find out today is that every one of us has a Pete in our lives. And for the love of Pete is the name of my message. And if you have found Luke chapter 10, we're going to read the story of the Good Samaritan, a story we all know. We're going to start at verse 25, where Jesus starts in, and this is what it says. It says, behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, what is written in the law? What is your reading of it? So he answered and said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said to him, you have answered rightly. Do this, and you will live. Now, this lawyer actually got the answer to this question correct. And he went all the way back to Leviticus 19. It's actually Leviticus 19 that says to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And this is what we call today the Great Commandment. I don't want to underestimate the importance of this statement. This is the Great Commandment. All of the other commandments, all the other laws, and all the prophets hang on this, Jesus said, to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, normally when you read this, when you think of neighbor, what do you think of? You think of the person that lives near you, don't you? You think of the person that lives next door or across the street or in the next apartment. We think of that in those terms. And that's not really what the story's talking about, which we'll find out in a moment. But I think it's a good start, don't you? I actually had a neighbor named Pete. Now, first of all, I had a neighbor named Dan. Oh, I like Dan. Dan was a great neighbor. He used to loan me his tools. He'd come over and fix my lawnmower. But then what happened is he retired and moved to the country, and the house went up for sale, and a young couple bought this, and I was thinking, oh, a nice young couple is moving in next door. But that's not what happened. Pete and his wife moved in next door. The first tip-off was the day they moved in, when the pickup trucks and motorcycles arrived. These were all his redneck buddies. Equal amounts, pickup trucks, motorcycles, and cases of beer. And then the second tip-off was when the furniture didn't go into the house, it went into the garage, into the man cave. And this guy had all kinds of animals. He had dogs, and he had ferrets, and he had wild animals running loose around the neighborhood. And he'd have his buddies come over, his greaseball buddies, and they would come with their motorcycles, and they would go and they would drink beer and smoke pot in the garage right beside my front door. I did not like Pete. Pete, to me, was a nuisance. I didn't bother getting to know him because I didn't like him. And then one day what he decided to do was because Dan had a garden, he decided that spring he was going to dig up the garden, plant a garden. So he dug up the garden, planted it, and then he set the sprinkler on like this, and then he went away on holidays with the sprinkler running. And so every day I'd wake up and that sprinkler was running in the backyard. And I think, what's this dude doing? Is he like growing rice back there? And he's got the sprinkler going. And I realized his backyard was flooding. And it was completely soaked. It was completely turned into a lake. And the water was about to go over his window wells and into his basement. And I thought, how cool is this? And so I set up a lawn chair and got a lemonade and sat on my deck, which faced his backyard. And Kathy came out and said, what are you doing? I said, I'm watching the moron flood his basement. And she said, which one of you exactly is the moron? And she says, you were a bad neighbor. Are you not going to do anything about this? And all of a sudden, I was a little bit convicted, and I thought, oh, I guess I couldn't do this. So I went over and I turned the water off, and of course, eventually the backyard dried up. But then he never weeded it, never did anything else. And that garden, I never saw any vegetables in it. It was 6-foot ragweeds blowing in the wind and throwing seeds into my garden and into my yard. And I just absolutely couldn't stand Pete. But every time I would go to this book that we're just reading here, Luke chapter 10, and read the story of loving your neighbor, I was convicted. I thought, I don't love my neighbor. I don't even dislike him. I hate him. And I don't even know him. And so I decided I was going to change my attitude because I needed to. I was going to change my attitude towards Pete. And so what I did was when he was away on holidays or away and wasn't mowing his grass, which happened often, I would go mow his grass. In the winter, when we had a heavy snowfall, I would go and snow blow his driveway. And he came over and he was so grateful that I did these things. And it turned out that Pete was actually a really great guy. He was just different than I was. And then I figured something out. The reason most of the time that we don't like people is because we don't actually know them. We don't actually know them because we haven't taken the time to get to know them. And I actually got to know Pete, and I actually started to not mind him at all. And just because he was a greaseball doesn't mean he was a terrible person. And so what happened was he stayed there, and I moved. And so I moved into a new neighborhood, and this neighborhood was normal. You know what normal means, don't you? Boring. There was no Pete. And then one day, what happened was this new neighbor moved in right across the street from us, and he was all dressed in black, from head to toe dressed in black, and he had long black hair. And I said to my kids, stay away from that guy. He's a drug dealer. And my kids said to me, how do you know? I said, I just know I can tell these things. Anyway, a week later, this guy comes across the street to introduce himself to me. He says, hi, I'm Brian, and I just wanted to say hi. I'm trying to get to know some of the neighbors, but for some reason, they all think I'm a drug dealer. To which I said, you know, some people, they're so narrow-minded. I don't know how that's happening. So he says, what kind of a drug dealer has a wife and 3 kids and drives a Taurus? I'm a musician, not a drug dealer. I'm thinking, man, what, you know. Anyway, then catch this. Then he says to me, oh, by the way, I go to your church. I thought, I'm such an idiot. I'm accusing this guy who goes to my church of being a drug dealer and telling my kids to stay away from the Christian who lives on the other side of the street. He dresses in black, he's got to be a bad person. And you see, here's the thing. We tend not to like people because we don't know them, and we prejudge them, or they're different than us. But I don't want you to miss this. My message is called For the Love of Pete, and this is what I've discovered, is that every one of us has a Pete in our life. And as soon as you lose your Pete, you know what happens? God gives you a new Pete. And you need a new Pete, because Pete actually does something in us, because Pete provokes us to get out of our comfort zone, and Pete provokes us to start looking at people different and starting to like people that are maybe different than us, and it gives us an opportunity to love our God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And as soon as that one Pete is gone, it just seems like God puts another Pete into your life. And that Pete could be your neighbor, but he could be the guy at work, he could be your boss or your brother-in-law, or he could be the guy sitting on the bus next to you, or whoever. But we have people that we encounter in life, and God puts them there for a purpose to teach us this thing called loving our neighbor, because it's one of the most challenging things you will ever do, is to love your neighbor. Now, I want you to go with me back to the story, because we're not done yet. So this man figures out that the great commandment, and Jesus, I think, was impressed by this. He said, do this and you shall live. To love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. But let's pick the story up in verse 29. But he, the man, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Ah, there's the rub, right? Then Jesus answered and said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a certain priest came down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise a Levite, when he had arrived at that place, came and looked and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him, and he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you. So which of these do you think was neighbor to him who fell among thieves? And he said, he who showed mercy on him. Then Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. You know, it's interesting here that Jesus tells this story about what it is to love your neighbor as yourself. And he gives this famous parable called the parable of the Good Samaritan that we all know. And he has 3 kinds of people that he uses in this story. And what we need to do is we need to take a moment and talk about who these people are. There's the priest and the Levite and the Samaritan, and they were chosen very specifically. And what we need to do is transpose those people into today's culture and ask this question, who would those people be today? So let me ask this question. Who would the priest be in this story today? Yeah, it would be me. You're absolutely right. The priest would be me. It would be the clergyman. It would be the pastor. And who would be the Levite? Because the Levite, they were the people of the holy tribe. They weren't necessarily priests, but they were part of the priestly tribe. They were the holy tribe. So who would be the Levite in this story? Yeah, that would be you. You thought you were getting off the hook here. You're not getting off the hook. And so the priest, he passed over on the other side. The Levite, which is you, God's priestly or holy people, you too crossed over on the other side. And then the third person that comes along is a Samaritan. Now, I need to take a moment and tell you the importance of the fact that Jesus used a Samaritan in this illustration to be, we don't call him the Samaritan, we call him the what? The Good Samaritan. And you need to understand that for the Jew, the only good Samaritan was a dead Samaritan. Because here's who the Samaritans were. The Samaritans were the offspring of the tribe of Ephraim and the half-tribe of Manasseh that came over into the Promised Land. They were the offspring of those people, but what they had done was they had interbred with the Gentile people, with the Canaanite people. They had interbred, and therefore they were the excluded half-brothers of the Jewish people. And they were absolutely despised, so much so that they were excluded from temple worship. The Jews did not let the Samaritans, which they considered in their minds, indelicately referred to as half-breeds, and they did not allow them to come and participate in the temple worship in Jerusalem. So you know what they did? They built their own temple in Samaria on Mount Gerizim. And guess what the Jews did? They went and destroyed that temple. And so there was a little incident that happened in 9 AD, and this is what happened, was during the Passover, the Samaritans went into the temple in Jerusalem and desecrated it by scattering human remains around the temple. Huge act of blasphemy in 9 AD. Now I want you to think about the term, the date of that, 9 AD. Jesus would have been 14 or 15 years old. How old was he when he began to go to the temple in Jerusalem? Yeah, he was 12 years old. So that meant this, that Jesus knew that story. He knew about when the Samaritans had come and desecrated the Jerusalem temple. And he knew of the hatred, and he knew of the prejudice, and he knew of the acrimony that existed between the Jews and the Samaritans. And so then he's telling this Jewish lawyer, he's telling him a story about what it means to love your neighbor. And who does he pick as the hero? He picks the Samaritan as the hero. And this is really, I'm trying not to underestimate this. I want you to understand the importance of who he chose to be the hero in this story, because it's incredible that the Samaritan was the person that was the hero. Now, understand something about Jesus. He didn't just tell this story, he practiced what he preached, because you will remember that Jesus went and he ministered to a Samaritan. Who was that person? Does anyone remember? It was the woman at the well. Do you remember? Jesus was going through Samaria, and the disciples had gone to town, and he met this woman, a woman of ill repute, actually. And he begins to speak to her, and she says to him, how is it that you, a Jewish man, are speaking to me, a Samaritan woman? And what Jesus did, what Jesus practiced, what he preached, is he was breaking down the racial and the religious and the gender gap that existed in his own day. And he was proving that he was living this very message about how to love your neighbor and how you need to be able to cross over to touch people and consider people that would not necessarily be your brothers, but they are your neighbors. And we need to learn to love our neighbor. Now, I'm going to ask this question. I'm going to ask 3 questions. The first question is this. We need to read this story, and we need to figure out who we are. Now, I know I said you were the Levite, but that doesn't necessarily make you the Levite just because you're a Christian person. When we read this story, we need to say, who am I? Am I the priest? Am I the Levite? Or am I the Samaritan? Now, we'd all love to think that we are the Samaritan in this story, wouldn't we? We'd all think that that's who I'd like to be. But if we're really honest with ourselves, most of the time we're not. You see, Jesus doesn't tell us exactly why the priest and the Levite crossed to the other side. But we know, we can imply from this story that they knew they should have done something. And so to avoid the situation, they crossed over onto the other side of the street to avoid the situation altogether. They knew what the right thing to do was. They were deliberately avoiding it. And James 4:17 says what? To he who knows to do good and does not, to him it is? It's sin. It's sin. Now here's the unfortunate thing for me when I read the story of the Good Samaritan. I know who I am. I am that priest. I am the one who crossed over to the other side. Now I'm trying to change that. But I had an incident in my life, some of you heard this story, but I had an incident in my life that so defined that moment that I have worked hard since then to change it. It happened 25 years ago. I was at a conference on evangelism, of all things. I was in the city of Ottawa. I was with a friend. We were taking courses in the morning, then it was lunchtime. That afternoon, after lunch and after the afternoon session, we were going to go out in the street and we were going to evangelize and share the love of Christ with people. But we were on a lunch break, and so we were walking to the restaurant, and we were walking down the street, and I was walking, my friend was walking beside me, and I was doing what I do. Guess what I do? Yeah, I was talking. Yeah, I was walking down the street, and I was talking. And my friend was doing what my friends do. What do you think my friend was doing? He was listening. What, have you guys heard this story before? And so I'm walking down the street and I'm talking. My friend is walking down the street and he's listening. And I'm going on and I'm talking about loving our neighbor, and I'm talking about sharing the gospel. And I'm talking about, how we're going to evangelize people. And then what happens is a homeless man with one leg and 2 crutches, his crutches go out from underneath him, and he splayed literally on the sidewalk. And I was busy because I was telling a story, and what I did when he fell in front of me is I stepped over him like this, and I kept on walking. Oh, look at you. Shame on you. Shame on you. In my own defense, I didn't cross to the other side now, did I? Right? I stepped over him because I didn't see him. How bad is that? I think in a way that's worse. Imagine stepping over a fallen homeless man and not even seeing him. Now what had happened, again in my own defense, I only went a few steps. And after a few steps I stopped because a strange feeling had come over me. Something had changed. You know what had changed? There was no one listening anymore because my friend had stopped to pick up the man who had fell down. And as a quintessential extrovert, I'm not talking if nobody's listening. And I stopped and I said, where's my audience? I looked back and there's my friend picking up the homeless man. And I thought in that moment, I am a bad person. That's what I was thinking, just like you're thinking now. You're thinking, I'm glad that never happened to me. You are a bad person, Pastor Mark. Well, at least I know who I am in this story. You're sitting there pretending you're the Good Samaritan. Goodness. So anyway, ever since that point, I've thought, you know what? I can't go through life like that. I cannot be violating the great commandment and not loving my neighbor. And I decided when I see someone in need, if I see someone and encounter someone, I'm going to change the way I react and respond. Here's what I don't want you to miss in that story. is that we want to avoid those situations in life because they look awkward, and more often than not, we have a good excuse why we don't want to get involved. We almost always have a good excuse. Sometimes we think, well, these people brought it on themselves. Is that a good excuse to say they brought it on themselves? Because what we do is we all have reasons and excuses why we don't want to get involved, but the fact of the matter is Jesus said to love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself, and if you don't love others, then the love of God is not in you. You see, that's the nature of loving God. You love God, and because you love God, you are compelled to love others. So the first thing I'm going to ask you, and it's up to you to decide this, who are you in the story of the Good Samaritan? Now, the second part of this is, now who is your neighbor? Who exactly is your neighbor? Now, one of the things is this, is that we think our neighbor is the person who lives close to us or is next door to us, as I said, and that is really not what this story indicates. You see, the people who are close to you and the people that you love and the people that you care about, those aren't your neighbors, those are your brothers. And your neighbor, as we find out from this story, is the people that you encounter along the way that have needs. And what happens is it said that the Samaritan, as he journeyed by, he encountered this person. Their lives intersected is what happened. He could have avoided him, but he chose not to avoid him. And what they are, what these things are, is these are divine appointments. You see, God gives us divine appointments, and he puts people in your path that you are to love, and those people become your neighbors because they are in close proximity to you, because your lives have interfaced, your lives have intersected, and you have to look at that situation and say, is this person my neighbor? And there are so many different ways that we can love our neighbor. I want to tell you a story today about Brock Brigham. And Brock, he's actually got a master's in divinity. He worked in church work. He was a pastor. He does different things today. But as much as he loves the gospel, he has another love as well. And his other love has always been shoes. I know, he's a guy, weird, right? And you ladies get it. But this guy had an absolute passion for shoes. And he couldn't decide whether he should go into the ministry or the shoe business. And he decided that he'd find a way to combine the two of them. And so in the 1990s, he started a shoe store in San Francisco called the Subterranean Shoe Room. And the reason it was called the Subterranean Shoe Room was it was in a basement storefront on Mission Street in San Francisco. And what happened was this. It was a very Spartan-looking place with boxes of shoes everywhere. And then he had a big chaise lounge in the very middle of the shoe store, the shoe room. And people would come down, they'd be looking around, and he'd say, do you know what you're looking for? And they say, no, we're just browsing and looking, we're not sure what we want. And he'd say, I bet I can tell you what you're looking for. And they go, oh, a bit of a challenge. And he says, why don't you lie down on the couch? Well, this looks particularly like a psychiatrist's couch. And he says, why don't you lie down on the couch and tell me your life story? And I'll tell you what kind of shoes you're looking for. And oftentimes, not every time, but oftentimes, people would take that opportunity to lie down on the couch and tell their life story and pour out their hearts to a complete stranger. And they would go on, and he would listen. And then what he would do at the end of their story is he'd go in the back, and he'd pull out a pair of shoes, and he'd open it up, and he'd say, is this what you're looking for? And they would go, that's exactly what I'm looking for. Because he was able to touch something about their heart. And what we've been telling you over these last few weeks is that people's real needs, for the most part, are not food and water and shelter. Most of us have those things. Our real needs are the brokenness and the woundedness and the emotional grief that people care. And what happens is when someone comes into your life that actually cares about you, that's how you love your neighbor. Your neighbor is the person who has real emotional needs, and we minister into those needs. All right, so who are you in this story? You need to figure that out. Who is your neighbor? Your neighbor is simply the person that your life collides with, intersects with, those divine appointments that God gives us every day or every week. The last and the final thing is this. How do I love my neighbor as myself? How do I love my neighbor as myself? That is a very high bar that's been set here. And look at the story of the Good Samaritan. What did he do? He put the man on his own beast. He took him to the inn, and he paid the innkeeper 2 denarii. A denarius was a day's wage. 2 denarii then is 2 days' wage. If you translate that into today's money, how much is 2 days' wages? This is $300 or $400. And then he said, whatever more it costs, I'll do. This was a complete and utter stranger. And yet what he did was he went to extraordinary lengths to help this man who was broken and wounded, and other people were ignoring him. I want you to think about the command to love the Lord your God with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. The way we love ourselves and the way we love ours and our own is different than the way we love strangers. Am I right about that? See, let me ask you a question. If you had a child that was sick, how much would you pay to get that child well? Everything. Everything you would give everything you have for you or your own, but we wouldn't do that for a stranger. And yet, in some way, or at least in a hyperbolic way, Jesus is saying that's how we are to love our neighbor. Let me tell you one final story in closing here, and it's the story of Bob Seaman. Bob Seaman was suffering from kidney failure. He was on dialysis several times a week, and he was going to die. And he was in desperate need of a kidney transplant. But what had happened was there was none coming forth. And then one day one came forward, and what he had discovered was this, because it's all done anonymously, is that the kidney that he was receiving was not from an accident victim, which is normally the way you get them. It was a living donor who had anonymously donated her kidney to whomever had a need. This woman, her name was Brenda, donated her kidney, went down to the donor bank and gave her kidney up for whomever could use it, because she said, I got an extra one. And her husband thought she was crazy and didn't want her doing this, but she did it because she just felt compelled she needed to do this, because she thought maybe she could save someone or improve somebody else's life by giving up her kidneys. So she gave up one of her kidneys for a complete stranger that she had never met and was never going to meet, or at least that's what she thought. So Bob gets the new kidney. Bob gets a new lease on life. And Bob inexplicably starts writing poetry on Facebook about kidney transplants. And one of Brenda's friends says, you're going to love this guy. He got a kidney transplant because they were in the same city. He got a kidney transplant, and he writes poetry. You love poetry, and this guy loves poetry. So she goes on and starts reading the story and realizes that Bob's got her kidney. It's supposed to be anonymous and confidential, but if you can figure it out, good for you. And so she ended up contacting Bob, and Bob and Brenda met. Here's the picture here. And they met, and they became great friends, complete strangers, and he's carrying her kidney. I'm just glad it didn't go the other way. Imagine if the kidney had gone the other way. She'd be into NFL football and nachos and pizza. She would have been, that would have been sad, right? But nevertheless, something terrific happened in this story. And here's how I stumbled onto this. Guess where it happened? It happened at the Good Samaritan Medical Clinic in Seattle, Washington. I thought, how cool is that, that it's all about being the Good Samaritan. So, who are we in this story? You're going to have to decide for yourself. Who is your neighbor? The person that your life intersects with as you journey on your way. A person who has needs that you can solve that problem. And then how do we love our neighbor as ourselves? This is the hard part, because we're probably not going to give everything that we have for our neighbor or a stranger. But this is what Mother Teresa was asked one day. She was asked, what is the greatest problem that faces humanity today? And she said, this is the problem, is that the people's circle of their family is too small. And what we need to do is we need to increase the size and the circle of our family every single day. And if we would increase the circle of our family every single day, our world would become a better place. That's how you love your neighbor. That's how you love your God and love your neighbor as yourself.
If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. Visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.